Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Episode 2, The Continent Before the Cross, Pre-Christian Africa. To understand how Christianity came to Africa, it's important to understand the peoples and nations that inhabited the land when Christianity came along. Since Christianity first came to Africa via the Roman Empire, that means beginning our story with the people of Africa right before the Roman conquests in Africa began, in about 200 BC or so. One of the most important groups of native peoples in Africa is a group of people traditionally referred to as the Berbers. However, that traditional name may not actually be the best way to describe them. The oldest records we have actually call this group the Barabara, which is rather different. Berber is a name that in Arabic means barbarian, which is not at all nice. It's not clear if the original name Barabara just got collapsed into Berber, or if the Arabs decided to collapse it during the Arabic conquest as a way of making fun of them. Whatever the root term, we know that some people prefer the term Amazigh for this group. However, that preference is by no means universal. There are plenty of people in this group today who will refer to themselves as Berber with pride. For the most part, I'm going to stick with calling them Berbers, since it's the one most people are familiar with, and it's a generally accepted term by the people to whom it refers. In fact, I even got called a Berber once. You see, I traveled to Morocco last year, which was very exciting for me. But one of the more forbidding parts of the trip was that in Morocco, haggling was expected. Everybody told me that I needed to haggle with the merchants. It was expected, they said. I should do what they said. It would be a growth experience, they said. This was very, very hard for me because I hate the idea of arguing somebody down on their merchandise. I just want to have a price and then decide whether I want to buy it or not, and let that be that. But I decided to be brave and try it. And I found a piece of art that I like, and the merchant named his price. Then I asked if he could do half of that. He chuckled and said, "You bargain like a Berber," and offered 70% of the original. I took it, and it was fine, and I felt good about it, like I had successfully haggled. I didn't do as well the next day, though. I found a scarf that I wanted to get as a present, and I asked if they would go for a lower price, and the merchant just shook his head and said, No, sir, no, we don't do that here." And he just looked so disappointed in me, like I was stealing bread out of his kids' mouths. I couldn't do it. Ugh, figures. Where embarrassment doesn't work, they'll get you with guilt every time. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, the Berber tribes, also known as the Amazigh. Anyway, long before the Berbers were out-haggling conflict-averse tourists like me, they settled all across North Africa. They are about as indigenous as anybody can be in the high-travel world of the Mediterranean. As far back as our histories of North Africa go, so far back do the Berber histories go. It's difficult to even tell the history of the Berbers because they didn't form one kingdom, one nationality. They didn't settle in one place. They don't even have one language. Berbers have the distinct honor of creating a whole family of languages, which are almost all mutually unintelligible to each other. There are about 7 major branches of Berber languages. Now, Berber people settled throughout North Africa, and they did form a whole bunch of different kingdoms throughout the years. Mauritania, Numidia, and more. They also settled much of modern-day Morocco, where they would remain outside the influence of Roman Africa, at least in part. The origins of the Berber people were shrouded in mystery even in ancient times. Some Roman historians thought that Hercules had come to Africa with his army and created the Berber people through their intermarriages with locals. More biblically literate scholars said that the Berbers were descendants of Ham, son of Noah, which is honestly kind of lazy, because most of those scholars thought that all Africans were descended from Ham, so whoop-de-doo, that says nothing. They just invented some fake descendants of Ham to ascribe the Berber origin to and called it a day. To the extent that modern science can help us answer questions of origin, it looks like the Berber peoples are related to other groups in the western part of Asia, what we often call today the Middle East. It's likely their ancestors migrated west from the Middle East into Africa, probably mixing with some groups from southern Spain who immigrated to that area as well. Whenever they came to Africa, it looks like they did it pretty quickly, because the various languages they spoke are fairly similar to each other. If there had been a gradual migration, we would expect more diversity in language. Those that settled earlier would change their language more, and those that came later would have changed it less from the original. Since that didn't happen, it's probable that they all plopped down more or less at once. When did that happen? It beats me, and beats most scholars. Like I said, the Berbers have been around there for a long time. Our best guess is that all this happened by 2000 BC at the latest. For reference, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt is dated to around 1300 BC. So the Berbers were in Africa at least 700 years before that, and probably even longer. Berber life changed dramatically with the rise of Carthage. Now, we're going to be talking about Carthage a lot for the next few episodes, especially when we talk about the Roman conquest of Africa. What you need to know for now is that Carthage was a city-state in modern-day Tunisia that was founded by people of Punic ancestry. The Punic ancestry is a Semitic ethnicity that was known to the world as the Phoenicians, and to the Israelites by the name of Philistine. Carthage was a very big deal in the ancient world. So big that there was a mythical story about its founding. The story goes that the ancient Phoenicians sailed up and asked the Berber leaders for a bit of land to found a new city. The Berber leaders were like, no, we don't know you, and we don't just give away our land for free. The Phoenicians were not deterred, and so haggled it out with the Berber leaders, who finally said to them, okay, fine, you know what? Here is the skin of an ox, just an ordinary ox that we killed for meat. Have as much land as you can cover with this ox skin. They meant it as a joke, but the Phoenicians said, challenge accepted, and cut the ox skin into super thin strips and managed to encircle an area big enough to build their citadel. Now that's the legend. There is no historical merit to this story at all. But it was told a lot, especially in Rome, because it confirmed their prejudices about the ethnic groups involved. Romans tended to think of the Phoenicians as sneaky, and of the Berbers as being a bit too simple for their own good. Outside of the realm of myth, Carthage was founded sometime in the 800s BC. In Phoenician, the name Carthage means new city because, well, it was the newest city they'd made. The Phoenicians don't get a lot of credit for creativity. Carthage was probably founded by settlers from Tyre, which was a Phoenician city in modern-day Lebanon. They were looking for a new city that they could use as a base for their operations more in the western Mediterranean that they could easily defend. Carthage fit the bill. Carthage's power would grow with the coming centuries, but unlike Rome, the Carthaginians felt no particular need to conquer their land neighbors. In fact, at the beginning, they paid tribute to the nearby Berber rulers, which is probably where that mythic story of the land deal got its start. Carthage was more of a trade empire. If you tried to conquer their trading partners, they would crush you. If you tried to trade with their neighbors too much and cut into their profits, they would sink your ships. And if you really got on the Carthaginians' nerves, they would invade you and force you to surrender, and then make you sign a peace treaty promising to stay away from the trade routes that they wanted. Numerous Greek kingdoms found that out the hard way. So did Rome at the beginning. But beyond that, Carthage was relatively content to live and let live, and that included their Berber neighbors. That does not mean the Berbers were unchanged, however. First of all, as Carthage's economic power grew, so did their influence in the region. And by the 300s BC, a lot of nearby Berber kingdoms had basically become vassals of Carthage. Now notice that I said Berber kingdoms. The fact that the Berbers organized themselves into kingdoms appears to be a result of Carthage. Berber peoples began to organize themselves into larger groups, eventually forming these kingdoms, in part because of Carthage's example. And they were respected. Romans and Carthaginians treated and dealt with the Berbers like they did other kings, which of course doesn't mean they particularly liked them, But they didn't just see them as small, petty tribes to be ignored. The great empires of the day saw the Berbers as powers that needed to be managed, and occasionally contended with. Berber religion also fused with Punic deities. Berber peoples practiced ancestor worship, or ancestor veneration, depending on what you want to call it. One's ancestors were believed to have power over one's life, and so it was common for Berbers to pray to the ancestors for good luck and stuff, but especially for fertility. Ancient Berber shrines include idols of one's ancestors that have enlarged genitalia, which are a pretty common feature of fertility worship in the ancient world. When mixed with ancestor worship, the enlarged genitalia also make things a little weird. That's why In Simeon's Wake is brought to you by Sigmund Freud, who is no doubt muttering about how many people laughed at him for his theories when ancient people were doing this kind of stuff all along. Sigmund Freud, he didn't make it weird. He's just the one who told you it was weird. Above all, though, Berber ancestors were believed to be able to predict the future. Now, you might think that's not a particularly useful trick since the dead don't usually answer our questions. That is because you are not an ancient Berber. You see, Berber shrines to the dead had these little stone couches in them. If you wanted to hear what the ancestors had to say, all you had to do was go to a shrine and do a ritual and then have a nap. Whatever you dreamed during the nap was the ancestors' response to your questions. Berber kings were thought to be especially good diviners, and they often performed these rituals when they were seeking wisdom for their kingdom. Now, the art of how you interpret a dream you've had in one of these tombs is lost to us. Let's say, hypothetically, you had a dream in which you had a big fight with your family, and then you went off to find yourself by taking a long bus ride through the mountains of Uzbekistan, and you were sitting on the bus next to this 8-year-old kid named Eusebius of Caesarea, and you thought to yourself, that's odd. That's the same name of one of the main characters of the Nicene controversy that I did a whole podcast about, but whatever, that's neat, I guess. Then the bus breaks down and you radio for help, but no one answers your calls. Then Eusebius says, hey, look at that cave over there. Maybe we find some rare minerals that we can use to fix whatever part of the bus is broken. So you and a few others go in there with him and you see a bunch of ancient cave paintings on the wall, and you realize you didn't just travel in space on this bus, no, you traveled in time. This is the 300s AD, and the reason no one is responding to your radio calls is because radio doesn't exist yet. And just as you realize this, killer robots swarm the cave and start shooting lasers at everyone, and you realize it was a trap. Eusebius of Caesarea set you all up, but before you can do anything, 2 Amazon drones grab him and fly him to safety as he shouts, "Yes, it's me! I did it! I am Eusebius of Caesarea! Remember this name!" Then you run out of the cave and back to the bus driver, who is oddly lackadaisical about the fact that, half the bus just got destroyed by killer robots. Anyway, years pass and you get back to the present day and you lead a peace pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And as you are praying at a monument, a gang of ruffians emerges and tells you to come with them. So you do, and you go through all of these winding underground tunnels, and you emerge in a building that looks an awful lot like that temple with all the snakes and Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. But it has Christian mosaics on the wall, so you know it's a church. And not just any church. It is the Lost Cathedral of Caesarea. But you knew that, didn't you, you mysterious leader of this gang of ruffians? Or should I call you Eusebius of Caesarea? And there he is, swirling around like an evil villain on his bishop chair, only because he didn't travel forward in time like you did when you got back on the bus. His body is mostly replaced by robot parts, and he has a scary cyborg eye that can shoot laser beams and stuff. And he cackles and says, "Yes, Ben, well done, well done. You have tracked me down across the years. I could destroy you today like I could have destroyed you all those centuries ago, but I am feeling generous, so I will give you a boon worthy of your cleverness. What would you like?" And you say, "Well, I would like for you to abandon your semi-Aryan Christology and confess the faith of the Universal Church." And he says, "Okay, anything but that." And then you're like, "Well, I don't want anything but that, and I'm not leaving until I get it." And he's like, "I still have my scary robot army here." And you're like, "Okay, well, I guess we're done here then." And then you walk away and the dream ends. What would the Berber interpreters make of that, huh? Hypothetically, I mean. Yeah, hypothetically. Berbers also began to worship some of the Carthaginian gods that had been imported from the ancient Near East, including Baal. If you know your Bible, then yes, I do mean that Baal, the one that the God of Israel kept getting super mad at the Israelites for worshipping. Baal was a storm god in the Phoenician pantheon, and he also played a key role in fertility. The Berbers probably had a pantheon of minor deities and spirits they worshipped as well, but unfortunately we don't have any evidence for who those might be. As the Berber population grew, they subdivided into 3 different ethnic groups: the Maori, the Numidians, and the Gaetulians. The Maori settled in the kingdom of Mauritania, which corresponds to the modern-day countries of Morocco and Algeria. This kingdom had a long and distinguished history of rulers, including Atlas, like the Titan Atlas from Greek mythology. Yes, apparently the story goes something like this. Ancient Greek writers thought that Atlas, the big titan who holds up the world on his shoulders, lived in the far west of the world. Since the farthest thing they knew was the western edge of the Mediterranean, they thought he lived around there. Also, apparently they thought that when Perseus went to the west, he turned Atlas into a mountain, which is where the Atlas Mountains in modern-day North Africa get their name. No word on how Atlas was able to hold up the world and or rule a kingdom when he was literally a mountain range, but we'll have to let the mythmakers have that one. Perseus also failed to properly bag the Medusa's head as he traipsed over the area, and her blood got on the ground, and when it mixed with the ground, it turned into all the snakes that you will find in that area of the world. Really very inconsiderate of him. We don't know much about the kingdom of Mauritania between the years of 500 and 200 BC. That's because we don't really know much about anything about the world then, so, not all that surprising. However, we do know that at some point, they created the single greatest invention of all time. The fulcrum on which all history turns runs straight through Northwest Africa. I am speaking, of course, of the culinary triumph that is known as the tagine. Made in a wide-bottomed clay pot with a conical lid, the tagine is the perfect dish. Into this extraordinary alchemical jar, you place some combination of a protein, meat, poultry, or fish, and fruits and vegetables. Then the dish is left over a low fire for hours, perhaps a whole working day, as heat draws the flavors out of the ingredients and into the dish, where they create a thick and pleasing broth, unctuous with fat and flavor. And with the right ingredients and spices, Moroccans are legendary for the way they blend sweet and savory flavors. Tomato, chicken, and honey, or lamb and spinach, or chicken, prunes, and toasted almonds. Even chicken, olives, and preserved lemon. Every single bit is a marvel, a complete culinary experience in and of itself. When you eat a tagine, you have an entire culinary experience in every single bite. There is no need for an appetizer or a dessert when you have a tagine, though in Morocco, there is plenty of both. Anyway, when the Maori weren't busy creating the single greatest dish in the history of the world, they were busy doing other things, living out their lives, and making trouble for Carthage. As far as living out their lives goes, the Maori were a combination of nomadic hunters and city dwellers. There's often a prejudice that all people in North Africa were traveling nomads, but that's not entirely true. City life was a feature of pre-Roman Africa. After all, it's much easier to make a tagine if you don't have to move all your stuff every day. Even today, we can see the ruins of many of these Berber cities, which featured massive tombs for their kings and high walls to defend themselves. Now, of course, most of the population didn't live in these big cities. Most of them lived in small villages as farmers. But that's also true of Rome, of Alexandria, and pretty much every other civilization at the time. The Berbers could keep pace with the best of them, and that included their neighbors in Carthage. The Carthaginians were powerful, but the Maori and other Berber tribes were not to be dismissed. At the height of their powers, they could even challenge the mightiest forces on the continent. One Maori king, Baga II, provided crucial military support to Rome at the end of the Second Punic War. The Berbers known as the Numidians were those closest to the kingdom of Carthage, and hence probably the most influenced by them. Numidians practiced a semi-agricultural life, with some cities and towns being more based on farming, while others practiced a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The nomads of Numidia are responsible for their greatest claim to fame, Numidian cavalry. Nomads around the world are really, really good at riding horses. And when you are really good at riding horses, that puts you in high demand for armies. Carthaginian generals regularly hired Numidian cavalry to augment their forces, which opened up all kinds of new tactical possibilities for a plucky and resourceful general. The most famous of those tactics was the feigned retreat. Basically, a feigned retreat worked like this. A bunch of cavalry units attack you. Then they act all scared and stuff, like you're beating them even though you totally aren't, and they start to run away. Then you, the silly infantry, are like, "Ha-ha, we have them now! Give chase!" And then you charge after the fleeing cavalry and probably get ambushed by all their friends who are hiding out and waiting for you to do something like that. It is amazing how many times the feigned retreat works. It worked for the Numidians. Arab horsemen used it against the Crusaders throughout the entire Middle Ages. You'd think that people would eventually realize, a highly mobile fighting force that we were definitely not beating just turned tail and ran and is incentivizing me to follow. I think... it's a trap! But no. Alas, few military commanders have had Admiral Akbar's level of insight. Numidian rulers were also a bit famous for playing the field. They might side with Carthage one day and its enemies the next. They tended to be political pragmatists, supporting whomever they thought had the wind blowing in their direction. The shifting loyalties of Numidian cavalry would play an important role in the Punic Wars. Beyond their military might, the Numidians also created unique kinds of pottery and had the odd distinction of apparently not having a currency system. There are some Numidian coins out there, but they appear to be mostly commemorative. Numidians do not seem to have used currency for their day-to-day economic transactions. That leaves the Gaetulians. The Gaetulians may not have actually been a unified ethnic group at all. South of the Numidians and Mori, down on the borders of the Sahara Desert. They mostly lived in small villages and tended to keep to themselves. They grew crops on the land, which was impressive because they were, on the edge of the Sahara Desert, and somehow they managed to grow asparagus that was 12 feet long. I am not making this up. Roman historians credit the Gaetulians with 12-foot-long asparagus. Now, those historians may be making it up, but I'm not. But if it's true, it's no wonder they kept to themselves. It would take all day just to eat that much asparagus. As a consequence, they weren't all that aware of all the goings-on with the big fancy empires around them. This annoyed the Romans, who had a bad case of main character syndrome and needed everyone to know who they were. In Simeon's Wake, brought to you by main character syndrome. It's a time-honored, age-old question. Why are you not obsessed with me? One of the most difficult things for us to learn growing up is that everybody else has a mind too, and that sometimes people aren't thinking about us. Sometimes they aren't thinking what we want them to think, and there are many people throughout the entire world who don't even know that we exist. But that all changes with main character syndrome. With main character syndrome, shoehorn yourself into every conversation, every social interaction. It's not about you? Well, it can be now. Main character syndrome. Making you the center of everyone else's story. Now, when you are a people living in huts and practicing agriculture on the border of the world's largest desert, you don't typically have too much use for kings. That didn't stop Roman historians from inventing kings for the Gaetulians, though. They thought the first king of the Gaetulians was a fellow named Iarbas, son of Jupiter, or Ra, depending on the story, and a nymph. He was a nice guy who lost out on the woman he loved to the mythical founder of Rome. Main character syndrome strikes again. Even in the myths about the origins of other people, the Romans have to win. But of course, the Berbers and Phoenicians weren't the only peoples in Africa at the time. To the east was another great and ancient culture, that of Egypt. One of the oldest of all civilizations. The Carthaginians had their trade, the Berbers had their tagines and 12-foot-long asparagus, but the Egyptians had pyramids, empires, kings with very impractical hats, ancient mummies with curses that could only be broken by a young Brendan Fraser. Obviously, the history of Egypt is long and glorious. For our purposes, however, the story of Egypt begins with them getting absolutely destroyed by Alexander the Great. Now, in fairness to Egypt, everybody got destroyed by Alexander the Great. That's why he's called the Great. So it's not like they were doing a particularly bad job or anything. Nobody could stand against the brilliant Alexander. Now, Alexander left Egypt as one of his client states and put a new set of Greek rulers on the throne. Client states are a pretty common feature in late antiquity. It can look a number of different ways, but essentially, what a client state is when a conqueror comes in, defeats the previous rulers of a country, and installs a ruler loyal to him. The expectation is that that ruler is going to do whatever the conqueror wants. If the conqueror wants armies, the ruler will supply them. When the conqueror wants tribute, and the conqueror will want tribute, the ruler will get it. In exchange for that, the ruler gets a fair bit of independence in how things go in that particular province. It also means that conquerors don't have to do quite so much of the tiresome work of integrating the conquered peoples into the empire. Giving them a slightly higher degree of political independence often produces a more contented populace. However, to be a Greek ruler in Egypt is somewhat precarious. You are a Greek-speaking monarch in a country with a long and very proud history of its own rulers, its own empire, and who speak a different language and have a very different culture than you do. And, although you have military control, the people don't particularly like the fact that you just conquered them. To make matters worse, your brilliant leader, who just conquered, practically the whole known world, kicked the bucket at age 32. And now all the other generals are fighting each other for control of his empire. What do you do? Well, if you are Ptolemy, the general in Egypt at the time, you do two things. First of all, you use the city that said general built, aptly named Alexandria, as a home base. Alexandria was a bastion of Hellenistic culture, and Ptolemy could be assured of having at least some allies there. Second, you take on as many of the trappings of Egyptian culture as possible. So Ptolemy took the Egyptian title of pharaoh, along with the other trappings of the ancient office. He ate like an Egyptian, he dressed like an Egyptian, he talked like an Egyptian. If the songs are to be believed, he walked like an Egyptian. He also married like an Egyptian, which meant royal incest. In the pharaonic household, brothers and sisters were expected to marry in order to carry on an ancient myth in which the god Osiris married his sister Isis and they ruled Egypt together. I really look forward to the day when In Simian's Wake is not brought to you by Sigmund Freud, but until then, here we are. There was a major catch to all of this, though. While Ptolemy adopted many of the outward trappings of Egyptian culture, he also spread Hellenistic culture to Egypt. He appointed his Greek officials to all the key positions of power in the city, and native-born Egyptians had to speak Greek and adopt Hellenistic customs in order to be appointed to positions of power. This is a classic method by which colonizers ensure the dominance of their culture. They don't crush the culture of the oppressed. They just require that the oppressed adopt their culture in order to get ahead. It's devious and extremely effective. Soon, all of Egypt would be thoroughly Hellenized, just like the rest of the Mediterranean world after Alexander's conquests. Ptolemy was also responsible for the construction of the Great Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was a really, really big deal. It is said to have contained just about every book imaginable, and it played a major role in turning Alexandria into a center of scholarly activity within the empire. Many of the greatest minds in Christianity trained in Alexandria. Ptolemy's library was a huge part of the city's appeal. Religion in Egypt was syncretistic. Ptolemy decided that his new empire needed a new god, so he made one up to go along with his dynasty. Yes, you heard that right. Ptolemy decided to just invent a new deity for everyone to worship. People sometimes joke about cafeteria Christianity, where you pick the elements of Christianity that you like and leave the rest alone. Well, if Christians were in the mall cafeteria, Ptolemy was down at the Build-A-Bear workshop. If the right god didn't exist, he would make it. This new god was called Serapis, and combined aspects of the Egyptian gods Apis and Osiris with Zeus, Hades, Asclepius, Dionysus, and Helios. Serapis was in charge of, well, basically everything. He was responsible for the sun rising, for medicine, and for fertility. This was a really big deal and might have been hard for the common people to accept. It was common enough for ancient cultures to identify one god with another one god. The Greek god Zeus was often identified with the Roman god Jupiter. They both had the same role as head of the pantheon. But to smush 7 gods with very distinct powers and identities into one new mega-god, Captain Planet style, was a stretch. Ptolemy, however, had the advantage of having all the pointy swords on his side, so the worship of Serapis would continue. To be clear, Ptolemy didn't suppress the worship of any other gods. If you wanted to worship Ra or Osiris, that was perfectly fine. Their temples were left intact, their priests unbothered by state interference. In fact, often their priests were rather favored by the new regime. And even when Ptolemy's line acknowledged Greek gods, they often did so in Egyptian style. The wife of a pharaoh might be called Aphrodite, but she would wear traditional Egyptian clothing, not Greek clothing, when she ruled. That was the religious and cultural legacy that Ptolemy left to pre-Roman Egypt. There is one other legacy he left that is significantly more difficult to talk about. It is the legacy of every single ruler in this dynasty being named Ptolemy. I'm not making this up. The guy we have been talking about is known to history as Ptolemy I, mostly because, after he died, his son was Ptolemy II, who was succeeded by Ptolemy III all the way down to Ptolemy XIII. Either Ptolemy had no idea what he was doing, or he really hated history nerds and wanted to make their lives as miserable as possible. Nowadays, historians just call this the Ptolemaic dynasty, because, what else are you going to call it? But Ptolemy caused problems for people down the line. Eventually, everybody got so bored that they had to start giving the Ptolemies extra names just to change it up a bit. So we got Ptolemy XII, Neos Dionysios, Ptolemy IX, Philmetor Soter II, and more. There was a little bit more diversity among the women, who could choose between Cleopatra, Arsinoe, and Berenice for names. The pharaoh that you have probably heard of called Cleopatra was actually Cleopatra VII. The story of the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty is a story of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies, which, come to think of it, would be a great band name. Anyway, the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty went basically thus. The first 3 Ptolemies did a pretty good job. Unfortunately, when Ptolemy III died, Ptolemy IV also lost his mother. He was under the sway of several powerful advisors who did not have the country's good governance at heart. He was not a particularly good military commander, as evidenced by the fact that some of the periodic rebellions from Egyptian peasants went way better than they were supposed to. However, these revolts had the benefit of allowing modern scholars to decode the entire ancient Egyptian language. Perhaps you have heard of something called the Rosetta Stone. Egyptologists were able to use this stone to crack the code of the entire ancient Egyptian language, opening up whole new avenues for understanding this ancient civilization. But the stone's original purpose was quite different. It was a formal declaration of the Ptolemaic dynasty celebrating their victory over some rebel groups. An Egyptian priest named Hugranafor decided that he'd had enough of the Ptolemaic dynasty with their boringly named rulers. Egypt deserved better rulers, far more interestingly named rulers like him and his son Ankhmachis. Their revolt did pretty well because, like I said above, the Ptolemy at the time was not a very good military commander. And maybe the Egyptian citizens were ready for more interestingly named rulers. However, after 19 years of fighting, and about 6 of ruling Upper Egypt, the Ptolemies crushed the rebels and created the Rosetta Stone to commemorate their victories. So that's what the Rosetta Stone was about. It ended up being a gift to Egyptologists everywhere, but originally it was just the boasting of a weak empire rejoicing in a fleeting victory. It would take several more generations for things to get really bad, but get bad they did. Ptolemy XII, Naos Dionysios, was such a weak ruler that the Alexandrians actually drove him out of the city and stopped his reign. To get his seat back, he turned to the most powerful force in the Mediterranean, which happened to be Rome. Now, Rome was powerful enough that it had already been interfering in Egyptian affairs. Previous Ptolemies had found it helpful to turn to Rome to bolster their fading empire. But Ptolemy II, Naos Dionysios, needed more. He needed Roman soldiers to return him to power. Which they did. Rome was more than happy to have a weak king on the throne in Egypt who would be indebted to them, not to mention reliant on their military support. It wouldn't avail Ptolemy XII much, though, because he died 7 years after being restored to the throne. He left the throne to his 17-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son named, you guessed it, Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII. Their reigns would see the end of the last shreds of Egyptian independence and the birth of the Roman province of the Oriens, which included Egypt. But that is a story for another episode. For now, we have to look at one last region of Africa, Ethiopia. Now, the land of Ethiopia in ancient times is not exactly the same as the modern country of Ethiopia. In the ancient world, Ethiopia and Nubia are kind of catch-all names for the lands south of Egypt. Nubia has been described as being 200 miles long and 5 yards wide. It was essentially the name given to those civilizations south of Egypt that relied on the Nile River. Simeon Bakos, the Ethiopian eunuch, was actually from the kingdom of Meroe, which lay in modern-day Sudan. But I'm going to keep calling it Ethiopia, since that was the name it was given in ancient times, and because he is such an important figure in Ethiopian Christianity. Human settlement in Ethiopia is truly ancient. Homo sapiens have been in the area since at least 60,000 years ago. During that time, numerous civilizations rose and fell, whole cultures developed and flourished, and we are not going to talk about any of that because I don't have time to walk through 60,000 years of history in this episode. So we're going to fast forward to the year 150 BC, which is approximately when the kingdom of Axum arose. Ethiopia is ideally situated for trade. It sits right on the border of the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, which meant it could trade with partners in Arabia, Egypt, the rest of North Africa, and all the way to India. Just as importantly, if anybody else wanted to trade on the Egypt to India route, the best route was smack dab through Ethiopian territory. That allowed Ethiopians to take their share of the pie, which in turn brought wealth to the region. That wealth facilitated the rise of various city-states which banded together in a confederacy, where the king of Axum ruled as first among equals. The king of Axum often took the title King of Kings, the very same title the Bible ascribes to Jesus. Interestingly, there is no evidence that being the King of Kings was a hereditary position. It's possible that each of the kings voted on a new King of Kings instead of the title just passing to the old one's son. Whatever the details of the political arrangement, the kingdom of Axum became a major power in the region, and significantly influenced both Arabia and Africa. Now, although Christianity would reach Ethiopia in approximately 34 AD with the arrival of one Simeon Bakos, I have to warn you that Christianity in Ethiopia will remain pretty marginal for the next 3 centuries or so. There were Christians, but they were not part of the main cultural narrative. Instead, Ethiopia was home to various forms of Judaism. Jews had migrated to Ethiopia a really long time ago, more on that in future episodes, and an indigenous religion based on the worship of a serpent king named Arwe. Arwe was kind of metal. He took the form of a giant snake. In fact, he was so giant that when someone tried to point him out, the other person would think they were looking at a hill off in the distance and Arwe was behind the hill. But then their companion would say, nope, Arwe isn't behind the hill, Arwe is the hill. Which is not what most people want to hear when they encounter a snake. I mean, I wouldn't. And I have petted an anaconda before, so I think I have a pretty high snake tolerance. Anyway, Arwe was super big, and consequently was super hungry all the time. The villagers of the area had to keep sacrificing all their cattle and virgin daughters just to keep him from destroying their villages. They were not exactly stoked about this arrangement, so they were very excited when a man came along to kill the snake. Now, how he kills the snake varies from tale to tale. In one story, the guy offers the serpent a lamb and a nice juice to wash it down that is actually poison. The serpent eats it and dies. Probably the most realistic, but the Hollywood adaptation would be so anticlimactic. In another version of the tale, the guy lays a trap for the Serpent King as he passes through a nearby valley. Actually, several traps. He buries iron traps in the road that snap at Arwe, and then he attacks him with fire like he's a Dungeons & Dragons wizard who only knows the fireball spell. That would make for a much better Hollywood adaptation. Then there is the later Christianized version, where the 9 saints, more on them later, they're important figures in Ethiopian Christianity. The 9 saints find a girl tied to a tree. They think she is the Virgin Mary, which is a bit odd because the 9 saints live in, like, the 400s, several centuries after Jesus' death, so presumably Mary has either died and or been carried up to heaven, depending on what you believe. The girl clarifies that no, she isn't Our Lady, she is just the latest poor girl to be sacrificed. She is a princess, too, which probably makes her extra tasty or something. Why are princesses always having to get eaten by dragons and serpents? Just then, Arwe shows up ready for his Ethiopian princess brunch, when the saints spring into action and stab him to death with a cross that conveniently happened to be lying around. Then there's some weird stuff where a bit of the dragon's blood falls on the girl's heel, and it turns into a donkey's foot, and her village won't take her back until she fixes the foot, which involves meeting King Solomon, and it's a whole thing. Stories always get weirder with the reboot. But anyway, it's a suitably metal death for a metal serpent king. Now, in these stories, the snake's killer usually becomes the next king of Ethiopia, and is usually confirmed to be the father of the Queen of Sheba that famously met with King Solomon in the Old Testament. Now, obviously, the timeline is a little different when the 9 saints get involved, but Solomon still shows up in that story. The fact that there are ties with the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that this myth comes after Christianity. Remember, there were a lot of Jews in Ethiopia, and the stories of King Solomon would have been well known in the time. It's possible that the myth reflects actual religious practices. The serpent probably had some special religious significance in Ethiopia. We know it did in a lot of the surrounding countries. And ancient Ethiopians probably practiced human sacrifice in some capacity, as did many cultures of the time. But even those are tentative guesses. We don't know much about pre-Christian Ethiopian religion. All we know is this: the fact that the Christian story would win out over the myth of a super cool, voracious, sacrifice-demanding, hill-sized, Tolkien-esque serpent king who can turn you into a donkey with his blood speaks to just how compelling the Christian narrative was. There was more to Ethiopian religion than super powerful princess-eating megasnakes, though. There was another, more traditionally polytheistic religion in which 3 gods were worshipped. Astar, who appears to be a gender-swapped version of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, Meher, the war god, and Beher, god of the sea. We know comparatively little about this religion, and it is not nearly as cool as the Arwe cult, so I'm just going to skip it. Know that there was a fair bit of religious diversity in the kingdoms of Ethiopia, as there was throughout Africa. So, that is the state of Africa before Rome begins to descend. Indigenous Berbers across the northwest part of the continent, an uneasy mix of Greeks and Egyptians in the northeast, and the people of Ethiopia to their south. Now, it's time to talk about Rome doing what Rome did best: conquering, pillaging, and occasionally negotiating its way into dominion. We'll turn to that story next time as we look for the beginnings of our trail following along in Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.